sure you've got questions. I've got a whole load of questions floating through my mind because we have covered in the morning session, or in this first session anyway, almost everything you could probably want to know about data and planning and experiences and learning points. So what are the questions you want to throw at this very powerful group of speakers? And don't be shy, please. Please. Have we got a roaming microphone? Yeah, it's okay.
Some really interesting presentations, but I was really struck by two challenges that Tim Broyd raised at the beginning of your presentation about housing and inequality within the city. And we can just sort of see over Mayfair and parts of Belgravia, which are very sort of rich parts of the city, and often very underutilised assets. They have investors from overseas that don't often sort of stay there. I read a quote, I think, by Grosvenor that indicated that in excess of 60% of ownership of those areas of London were overseas investors. And so I just wondered whether either the GLA or Tim had done any sort of mapping of how assets are utilised across London, and what policy implications that might have for particularly housing, but also infrastructure provision.
Perfect. Who wants to go first? I'm sure all of you have got an answer to that one. Who wants to go? Go on.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm the right Tim or whether you want the other Tim. Was it? You have to say that now, don't you? Just no. I mean, what you can do with modelling, for example, is to look at where people live and where they work or might work. I think that's one of the big questions, because the jobs aren't always in the right place, and the jobs aren't always even there. And so, if you can grab data, whether it's from the London data store, or we're doing this across the country. That UK model I showed you is grabbing employment data from within the primary urban areas of the UK. We're doing this in Jeddah, and we're looking at where the jobs are, where the people live, what the journeys to work look like, and how much pressure there then is on the spatial network that connects people. And you can try to reduce that pressure by effectively mixing use more, and reducing some of the spatial inequality, which I think is one aspect of inequality that we can detect by measuring the hierarchy of places, and then put in front of decision makers these facts and why the planning moves that you're suggesting are the ones that are addressing data as opposed to just addressing what you think is the problem.
Anybody want to join in? Go on. I see you.
I don't know that I'm keen to respond, but I feel that I should. I mean, clearly, housing provision is a massive issue in the capital, and the issue of inequality and the continued sort of squeezing of people at the bottom end, middle end, and indeed you could argue at the bottom of the top end is really challenging. I mean, I would just concur with what Tim said. Really, I mean, clearly we do work which looks at occupancy rates. And the prevalence of let's say foreign investors who use them as piggy banks, and we try and take as much evidence as we can into what are political and sometimes economically driven discussions, and there's always room to improve, and that's why I think the work of people like Tim is so valuable, because, again, being completely frank, there's a way to go. I think people like developers could provide us with a bit more information than they currently do. Of course, we draw on people like Savills for some of their data as well, but there's an improvement that we can make still.
Martin, sorry, can I ask a question of Tim? Is that allowed? I mean, it's just that the question asked was particularly about the Grosvenor estates,
yes.
Right? Now, Mayfair and Bayswater. My question really is, now those parts of London have been under a consistent governance for the last 300 years. Have you looked at those parts within overall London, and has that meant that they've withstood better the vicissitudes of the last century planning?
What a really good question.
There's no pressure. Well, Yeah, there's a door. I think that may well be one aspect, Tim, and having consistency of decision-making is one aspect. Having a long-term attitude to decision-making, I think, is absolutely inherent in a Grosvenor-type model, where it's a stewardship model that sees a century ahead as opposed to just 3 or 4 years, and then we'll make our money and we'll be off. I would also point out that these are beautiful places. You walk around, they have so many of the qualities that traditional cities have. Compact, they're lively at the ground floor, they're leafy, green, they're mixed use, and they are not just places for the super wealthy. There's also people of all incomes in there. And I would put the question to the new housing that we're building in London right now: does it look as good as Mayfair? And before someone says, well, Mayfair, that's a ridiculous thing to say. Mayfair is just a bunch of buildings, and when you look at them, they're very simple buildings, and they've just been very well looked after and created a very high quality of life. And if we're not building to that kind of quality, then maybe we're only going to overpressure the centre to the investors who want a quality return, and we're not going to get other parts of London or any other city equally attractive to the markets that are looking to invest in cities.
Quality and quantity then, not just about quantity. So to make sure the panel doesn't ask any more questions than when themselves, some really challenging ones. Gentleman at the back.
Right. Before I ask the question, I'll just point out I work for Ordnance Survey, just to declare an interest. Does the panel think that the current government's Brownfield Site programme, alongside the smart cities work that's going on, do you think that's an opportunity to take some of these points that Tim's raised about developing the infrastructure in London more in that direction and away from, as it's mentioned, the vicissitudes of the last 100 years of planning?
Who wants to jump in?
My response will be yes. But it's limited to that, really. It's
Too close a question.
Okay. Sorry, it was brownfield sites and smart cities. Well, I mean, I think I alluded to it in my presentation, and clearly I'm going to speak from a London perspective. One of the things that we really are trying to do now through the London Development Database and other initiatives is to bring forward as much brownfield as we can just to meet development needs. But 2 points. There's the Old Oak Common example that I gave, which is where we really are trying to stitch in smart from the outset. And, the truth of the matter is, in a place like Old Oak Common, a spade won't go in the ground for a number of years. The challenge that represents is that there's a two-speed process here. Technology moves on a pace. Local authority planning processes tend to be rather more snail-like. So I think there's a real need around us as government to inject as much smart as we can into the planning process, and maybe that's around some of these sort of community-based outcomes that remain meaningful over time, but that we somehow link to the technology. And my second point is that it is in fact quite refreshing. So in a place like the Royal Docks out in the east, we do now have developers who are actually coming to us and saying, look, we recognise the need to have a conversation with you that involves getting as much smart in as possible. Now, I have a point about BIM, actually, and this might provoke a bit of a response. And again, I will not, I profess to be rather ignorant about BIM and the complexities of it, but I hear people who evangelise about it, and I think there is so much good in it, and maybe there are ways in which it's really useful for prisons, hospitals, so on and so forth. But I was having a rather interesting discussion with a civil engineer a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying to me, but it's great, Andrew, you asking me to put BIM into the proposal that I put forward to you, but that is going to increase my costs to the power X, and that might not be very feasible for you as a customer.
More expensive?
BIM is still a relatively new concept to the industry, and there's still a lot of nervousness, shall we say, about it out there. And that does manifest itself in people trying to make an extra buck, because they're not only trying to introduce this new type of process, they're trying to finance the introduction of this new type of process. I think if you ask the question in 2 years' time, the answer will be the fees may actually reduce. And an example of that is the insurance side of the industry, who, when BIM first manifested itself into the industry, started to say, well, basically, if this is a BIM project, we're going to up the premiums because it's untested, untried. Now the reverse is happening. The premiums are staying the same, or they're saying this process actually reduces the risk, so we're seeing a reduction in premiums. So that's the thing I would answer that question. I'd also like to say that the questions, apart from that one, that have been asked so far, are outside of my sphere of expertise. But if I could find a solution to the issues raised, then maybe I could raise enough money to live in Belgravia or Mayfair. I don't know.
Fantastic. This is great from my perspective because the panel are asking themselves questions. But any more questions from you guys in terms of challenges and issues? Helen.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about transport mobility infrastructure. And I think the automotive industry has played a really strong role in how our streets have been designed, primarily for cars and vehicles to move as quickly as possible and get people out of the way. So we have all these barriers and wide roads in America and probably other parts of Britain as well, maybe not in central London. How can we use data to demonstrate how this doesn't work for people and pedestrians and other vulnerable road users, so that we don't build more of that kind of status quo transport planner says it has to look like this when we know that that's not actually good for most people?
Ooh, yes.
Well, I think it's already, the argument is making itself. So rather than have to try to marshal all the data to then present something before people, you might say, if we look at the way we buy online, whether it's John Lewis, Amazon, or anyone else selling online, what's normally happening is that is also being delivered to our door. And that is turning on its head, I think, the logistics that go into the running of cities. And there's an argument I think you can make that the fabric of our town centres and city centres across the UK is very largely determined by the turning radius of a large lorry. And so you end up with great sweeping curves that make pedestrian crossings longer, and you have the paraphernalia of signage and the sort of municipal reality of logistics. That is all changing if what's being delivered is just one little thing from a logistics centre on the edge of the city in a van or on a bike, no longer in a big lorry, to a whole series of shops on the high street. Then what happens is the shops on the high street don't need the storage space for the stuff they were selling because it's coming from a logistics centre, and if they're still in business and haven't been put out of business, they've become shop windows as places not necessarily to buy but to view potential product you go home and buy. And once the retail industry gets its head around this changed landscape, then you've got all of this new space available on the high street that used to be called storage space. That can be used for housing, that can be used for business, that can bring in a different mixed-use lifestyle without having to make cities necessarily any bigger immediately. And I think that's the kind of revolution that is coming from the evolution that we've seen in online purchasing recently.
I've an answer to the last question on BIM, if I may. Sorry. And I've got one or two thoughts. I've got one or two thoughts about city regeneration, but they're not professional thoughts. It's just that, Oh, no, okay. It's just that, I know Dundee quite well. I've got a flat up there because I've got a flat up there, and I think without these types of data, I mean, the Dundee City Fathers about 10 years ago set out on a road to, that's a bad pun, set out to give Dundee back the waterfront, right? Which over the last 50 years, they'd put all sorts of obstacles in the way, notably a 6-lane road with very few crossing points, and there was a really ghastly water palace, looked like something out of the mid-50s Russia. a couple of bad hotels, etc. They've all gone now. They've all gone, and there's a mixture of new housing and new public realm spaces. I think the retail will come, but it wants, it needs the investment on in the people first, which is transforming Dundee, yeah. Right? And that's, I think that's just common sense.
So be brave and remodel.
Be brave and redo. No, the question on BIM. Yeah, I think one of the reasons that the government decided to mandate use of level 2 BIM is that you can go to that stage without changing the contractual basis of work. And so it's both technically feasible, and you don't worry I wouldn't say estimators, you don't worry the commercial directors, the finance directors, etc. Yes, yes. But what we're doing by that is, I think in any of these changes, there's some technology, some process, and some people aspects. We're changing the technology, we're changing the processes, we're leaving the people with what they've got, right? So, to my mind, BIM is made for TOTEX. And as I said, level 3 BIM to level 2 is TOTEX to CAPEX. By only looking at CAPEX, which is where the thrust has been at the moment, the responsibilities are rebalanced, but the rewards and liabilities and risks are moved, but the rewards haven't been. Yeah. And so it's an unstable equilibrium.
That's a really good point. Really, really good point. Okay, on that moment, I think that's the end of the Q&As. We've now got coffees waiting for you. There are also some publications, I think, out the back. So feel free, if you want to look at some of the research that's been done in this space and a wider space around resilience. I think they're on one of the tables by coffee. We're back here at 11:05. So can you thank the panel again for what I thought was an excellent presentation.